I want to start this morning with a confession. I have, on occasion, thought I was better than some people. You know, in certain situations, with certain people, on certain occasions, I just thought, I'm glad I'm me and not them. I'm glad I'm not like them. And this is on some occasions. Actually, I should probably confess something else. That was not completely true. It's probably a little broader than that. I have often thought I'm better than people. Not some people, like all people. And I know how that sounds, but have you met people? I can't tell you how many times I found myself saying things like, "Why would you wear that?" Or "Why would you ever park here? Of all places, park here. Nobody can turn. Why are you parking here?" Or "Why would you ever say that?" Or what in the world would ever possess someone to do that? Or what kind of person would ever act that way? I find myself wondering why people can't think better, act better, talk better, respect better, value better, like me. And what's funny is the more I live, the more I think I'm not the only one who thinks that way. The more I interact with people, the more I counsel individuals, the more I realize this attitude of superiority is not unique to me. And I think it is a real problem. I think it is a real threat to healthy relationships. See, when we interact with others, we tend to do it through the lens of our experiences, through our sense of social norms, through our sense of personal values, through our good experiences or our broken experiences. And as a result, we cultivate the sense of superiority and arrogance. And most oftentimes, we're just not even aware that we're doing that. I can't tell you how many times over the years as a pastor, I've been caught in the middle between church family members, husbands and wives, parents and kids. And each side says to the other, "I can't even believe they would do that. I can't believe they would treat someone like that." Each person is pointing the finger at the other person, claiming the moral high ground based on an interpretation of an action, an interaction that is clearly subjective, but it's made to be morally objective. That we've sat and we've said, "That's wrong. What they're doing is wrong. It shouldn't be that way. How could anyone ever do that? I would never act that way." And time again, you watch families and friends and church members splinter over a view of the other that is more personal perspective than it is moral imperative. But because of one's sense of better than, it becomes evidence of another person's lack of moral character. I can remember years ago, kind of finding myself at somewhat of a crossroads in regards to my relationship I had with my brother. My brother and I have been close almost our entire lives. All growing up, we shared a bedroom, and we were typical brothers, especially brothers. We were only separated by 2 years. In that we got along really well sometimes, and we didn't get along really well sometimes, right? So as a kid growing up, you'd play, you'd do stuff. Some days everything was great. Other days you'd be on top of the other, punching the person in the face repeatedly. So this is kind of my ongoing relationship that I had with my brother all growing up. And we kind of separated, went to college and that kind of thing. We came back together in college at the same place up in Minneapolis. And I have this very very distinct view of family. This very strong view of family. And it's weird because most of my view of family was formed by watching The Godfather. So, the foundation of my belief as it relates to family is you never take sides against the family. That's the starting point. And so for me, in regards to my relationship with my brother, it was always my view that we were tight, my view that we had each other's back, my view that anything that would take place, we'd share with each other, we'd be there for each other. It was always about this idea of conversing, of sharing, of being engaged in one another's life. And if that didn't happen, if my brother didn't do that, I remember myself becoming really frustrated, really angry with him. And so time after 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 time, I would find myself frustrated in our relationship. And I remember specifically when he asked his wife to marry him. And he had asked her to marry him, some big deal. I don't even know exactly how they did it, but I remember finding out 3 days later from somebody else that my brother had gotten engaged. And I was so angry. And I was so mad, and I remember saying to my parents, I'm not going to be in his wedding. I refuse to be in his wedding. I can't believe how disrespectful it is. I would never, ever do that to him. And then I began to learn a little bit more about my brother. And I began to realize something for the very first time in my entire life. And it was this: not everyone thinks like me. This is the honest to God's truth. I swear to you, this is the honest to God's truth. When I began to talk to my brother and began to really interact with him, began to understand his personality, I realized for the very first time, not everyone in the world thinks like me. My brother is the type of person who will tell you he loves you and then tell you, if it changes, I'll let you know. Right? Anybody know people like that? And so for him, this idea of not constantly interacting, not constantly reaffirming, not constantly having this conversation with us, wasn't him being disrespectful, wasn't him being disregarding, wasn't him being a jerk. It was simply him being Joey. And just because I had this idea, or I had this perspective, or I had this approach, didn't give me the right to say my way, my idea, is a way through which I should judge others, or I should view others. It's interesting because I think a lot of us have these different experiences. A lot of us have these different interactions with people, and we dismiss them and we mistreat them because of this view that we might have. Now, I started this conversation by confessing something that most people would find arrogant or maybe even a character flaw. That there are times in which I think I'm better than others. But I would contend that the confession I made is a confession that almost every one of us should appropriately make. So many of us have allowed our relationships with people to deteriorate, to fracture, because we have the same mindset that I am better than you. We have this idea that I would never say something like that. I would never act that way. And almost every time it is because we lack the self-awareness to realize we are making judgments not based on some objective moral standard, but our own subjective personal standard. The lack of self-awareness that prevents us from filtering through our personal preferences causes damage to our relationships. But I'll take this even one step further, because I believe the gospel, the calling of Christ, requires us to take this one step further. Our lack of self-awareness about our own struggles, our own shortcomings, our own mistakes, our own brokenness, our own sinfulness is at the core of what prevents us from building healthy relationships and heal hurting relationships. See, the gospel teaches us that the key to relationship, to reconciliation, is a sense of empathy that is born of self-awareness. The gospel teaches us that bringing healing between people comes because we have a sense of compassion, a sense of mercy, a sense of empathy, born of a humble view of ourselves. It is fascinating, really, when you look at Scripture, how often God prescribes humility as the foundation for healthy relationships. And it really is this powerful prescription when you understand the depths of what the passage is saying. Philippians 2 says, "Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves." Or Ephesians chapter 4 that says, "I urge you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which you've been called, and with all humility and gentleness, with patience, bearing with one another in love, eager to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace." Look at that. He says, eager to maintain the unity in the bond of peace flows out of what? Humility. Or 1 Peter 5, where it says, "Clothe yourselves, all of you, with" what? Humility toward one another. "For God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble." These are just a few passages, and I can show you passage after passage after passage beyond this. These are just a few that I'm highlighting, and really without any further illumination or explanation, this instruction to deal with one another in humility, counting others more significant, to bear with one another with all humility, or to clothe ourselves with humility toward one another because God opposes the proud, should call us all to re-examine our lives and really to most likely repent. What I'm saying is just what I read to you, just the three passages I read to you, if I didn't explain anything else, if I didn't illuminate anything else, should challenge us, should call us to this place that we're probably not at right now. The idea that the way in which we build relationships, the way in which we repair relationships, the way in which we have healthy relationships is rooted in us being clothed in humility, should challenge us without any further illumination. Because I don't know about you, but I wouldn't say that the primary description of my interaction with most people is humility. But I'd say once you understand the implications of the word used in the New Testament that is translated to humility in the passages we just read, you'll begin to see something even deeper. You'll begin to see the pathway that's being laid out that makes a way for gospel-restored relationships. Let me explain to you what I mean by this in the words of Dr. Thomas A. Terrence, who's the Vice President of Ministry with the C.S. Lewis Institute. He says this: "We need to understand what Jesus meant when he called men and women to humble themselves. We discover that from the Greek word Jesus and the apostles use, tampianos, which conveys the idea of having a right view of ourselves before God and others. If pride is an exalted sense of who we are in relation to God and others, humility is having a realistic view of who we are before God and others." Now, in light of the passage we just read, where the word tapianos is translated as humility, I want you to hear that definition again. Humility is having a right view of ourselves before God and before others. So if the key to reconciliation, to unity, and to friendship is having a right view of ourselves before God and others, where do we start to capture that awareness? If the key to this, if the key to reconciliation, if the key to unity, if the key to restoration of broken relationship is having a right view of myself, being aware of who I am before God and before others, where do we go to begin to have that awareness? Where do we go to begin to have that understanding? How do we find an awareness that provides the platform for healthy relationships and the platform for healing relationships? Well, I would say that the first step is this: to be aware of our need for mercy in light of our brokenness. If we are going to build healthy relationships, if we are going to launch out into relationships that are born out of the biblical instruction of humility, it is essential for us to be aware of our need for grace as a result of our unbrokenness and our unworthiness. If we're ever going to be in a place in which we understand humility in this idea of who we are before God, you have to be aware of, you have to embrace, you have to understand who we are in our brokenness, in our sinfulness, in our need, my need for the mercy of God. I am better than is not a byproduct of having a right view of oneself before God. Every one of us need grace. None of us before God are right. None of us before God are pure without His grace to us. And so that means we have no right to consider ourselves better before others. It's coming back to the realization of the grace that's been extended to us. It's coming back to the realization of the mercy that's been extended to us, in which we get a right view of ourselves before God. This is why Ephesians 4 says, "Be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, as God in Christ forgave you." What's the reminder here? The reminder here is God in grace forgave you, so now you can be forgiving and tenderhearted towards others. It's the reminder of our place before God is the need for grace. It's why Ephesians 5 says, "Walk in love as Christ loved us and gave himself for us." The 5th chapter of Ephesians is reminding us that we in ourselves should have love towards others the way in which he gave love towards us, because we needed it. This is why Jesus says in Luke chapter 6, "Be merciful even as the Father is merciful." Be merciful the way the Father was merciful to who? To you and to me. Each of these statements, as it refers to our interactions with others, turns our attention to the gift of grace we needed from God in light of our brokenness. Every single one of these passages is talking about how we interact with others, how we have relationship with others, how we have unity with others, how we have healing relationships with others. And every single time he turns our vision, he turns our minds, he turns our eyes towards the gift of grace that he's given to us. In fact, I want you to look at the broader statement of Luke chapter 6, because in that he provides this even larger understanding of who we are before him. The entire passage here, or the entire section here in Luke 6 says this: "But love your enemies and do good and lend. Expect nothing in return, and your reward will be great. And you will be sons of the Most High, for he is kind to the ungrateful and the evil. Be merciful, even as your Father is merciful." Now, in the middle of this passage in which he's talking about this relationship that we can have, and he's not even talking about like my brothers and sisters. He's not even talking about my friends. He's talking about my enemies. In the middle of this passage in which he's telling us how to interact with our enemies mercifully and gracefully, there's this interesting phrase right in the middle of it, isn't it? "For he is kind to the ungrateful and evil." He's kind to the ungrateful and evil. Do you know who he's referring to here when he says that God is kind to the ungrateful and evil? Do you know who he's talking about? He's talking about you, and he's talking about me. The description that Jesus has for you and me, to whom God ends up being kind to, is the ungrateful and the evil, and he's talking about us. He's talking about the kindness he extends to us, the ungrateful and the evil, to bring us to himself. This is what the Bible means. This is what the Bible is referring to when it says, while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Do you understand? While we were yet still the ungrateful, while we were yet still the evil, Christ died for us. That God, in his loving mercy, in his kindness, gave to us, allowed for us, provided a means for us to be saved while we were still ungrateful and evil. Romans goes even further than that. Romans 5 takes us even further, and he says, while we were enemies, we were reconciled to God by the death of his Son. While we were enemies of God, he in his kindness gave to you and I, the ungrateful and the evil. The kindness, the vast kindness, the unbelievable kindness of the gift of his Son so that we might be redeemed. And then he says, be merciful as your Father is merciful, having extended kindness to us who are ungrateful and evil. As he has extended kindness to you, the ungrateful, to you, the evil, now be merciful the way he's been merciful to you. How many of us have allowed our relationships with people to be damaged and deteriorated simply because they were ungrateful? I did this for them, and they returned me that. So they can just forget about it. I saw their true colors, blah, 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 blah. How many times have we said things like that? How many times have we been confronted with people in which we gave to them something, and because they didn't come back with gratitude to the level that we thought they should, we said, I don't want anything to do with them anymore. They're toxic. We don't even get into the evil indictment. We break relationships at the ungrateful. Be merciful even as your Father is merciful. The definition of mercy, just to remind you guys, is compassionate or kindly forbearance shown towards an offender, towards an enemy. What you got to understand from this, what you got to realize from this, is mercy is not mercy if there hasn't been an offense. You can only show mercy to people who have offended you. You can only show mercy to people who have mistreated you. What mercy means is it's unearned. They don't deserve it. But when somebody does something, when somebody is ungrateful, do we show mercy as the Father has shown us mercy? I would contend if we don't understand this, we don't understand our place before God and his grace to us. Our brokenness required God's mercy. Humility, having a right view of one's place before God, informs us of our need for mercy. We are broken. We need his grace. And I want you to understand something else. This doesn't even touch on how our brokenness requires the mercy of others. Have you ever been there? Have you ever hurt your spouse? Have you ever said or done something to a brother? Have you ever treated someone in the church wrongly for which you needed mercy, for which you wanted mercy, for which you desired to have mercy in your own life? If not, you might be Jesus. So this doesn't even touch on this idea of understanding who we are before others. The idea of humility is having a right view of ourselves before God and before others. And when I've talked about it to this point, we're not even talking about the need for mercy that we need to have because of what we've done before others. The foundation for healthy relationships is an awareness of our need for mercy, our need for grace, our need for forgiveness. Because our brokenness before God required his mercy, because our brokenness before others requires their mercy. This provides a right view of ourselves before God and others. This provides for us humility that the Bible prescribes as the means for healthy relationships, for healing relationships. I think there's a second step that will secure healthy relationships and bring healing to relationships. It is to be sensitive to others' needs for mercy in light of their brokenness. The first step is to be aware of our need for mercy in light of our brokenness. But I think what takes us to the next level in which we can begin to see this healthy restoration of others, this healthy healing of others, this healthy restoration of relationship, is to be sensitive to others' need for mercy in light of their brokenness. It's important to start with reflecting on the mercy you need in light of your brokenness. But then it becomes hugely beneficial to be aware of others' need for you to be merciful in light of their brokenness. See, the first is a response to the gift that God has given you. And I think ultimately what that does is that feeds a healthy you. It gives you a right view of who you are before God. It allows you to reflect on his love and his mercy and his grace for you. And it strengthens you and it strengthens your bond with God. But providing mercy to others because you are touched with the reality of their brokenness, because you are overcome with the reality of their hurt, their pain, it strengthens the bonds you have with other people. That's ultimately where that bond gets strengthened. When you can look at somebody, you can say, I understand they're broken, I understand they're hurting, I understand they're in pain, and as a result of it, this is what's taking place. And so therefore, I am going to be merciful, I am going to be gracious. This is one of the pictures of the gospel work of Christ that too often gets under-examined. The Bible talks over and over and over again about how in Christ's ministry, he was motivated by compassion. How he looked on the people and was moved by compassion for them. He was moved by compassion to feed them. He was moved by compassion to heal them, to pray for them, to cry for them. But even more deeply, the Bible talks over and over again about how Christ's coming, how Christ's incarnation, how Christ taking on the form of man, even as he was divine, meant he could be then touched with our infirmities. It meant he was tempted in all ways like us. I want you to hear the words of the author of Hebrews when he writes and says, "Since then we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God. Let us hold fast our confession. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin. Let us then, with confidence, draw near the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in the time of need." This passage is telling us that the gospel tells us that his understanding of our brokenness, our weaknesses, paves the way for us to come with confidence to receive mercy and grace in the time of need. It tells us that part and parcel of the work of Christ is the empathy he has for us, the grace he has, the grace flows out of the compassion he has for us. It leads us to have to understand that that is a pathway to restoration and reconciliation. The pathway to reconciliation, to redemption in relationship will come when we are touched with the hurt and the pain of those we seek to have relationship with. When we cultivate a heart that says, I get it, I understand, it's okay, I get why you're lashing out. I get why you're hurting. I've said this before. Hurting people hurt people. When people inflict pain on others, it's mostly because they're acting out of the pain that they've experienced. And it is beyond the ability of us to find reconciliation if we don't have that realization, if we don't put ourselves in a place and understand the reason they're acting this way, the reason they're acting out this way, the reason they're behaving this way is because they've been hurt. It's because they're hurting. It's because they're in pain. And we are so fixated on our own hurt, our own pain, our own disrespect that we can't see the pain, we can't see the hurt that is causing them to act that way. And in that we betray the gospel. We betray the work of Christ, who was touched with our infirmities and who, as a result of that, is the intermediator for us, who allows us to go boldly to the throne of grace and receive grace. We will never be instruments of healing in people's lives if we don't realize that they are breaking things out of their own brokenness. I've been blessed. I've never been the victim of abuse. But I know people who have. And I know that the pain of that causes them to do painful things. So I choose to absorb some of that pain and return to them love so they might find healing. I was never neglected or abandoned by my parents. But I know people who have been. And I know that abandonment causes them to push people away. So no matter how they treat me, I won't push them away, but I'll draw them closer in spite of themselves so that they might experience the security of family. Every one of us is confronted with people who are hurting. And if we refuse to give of ourselves, to receive hurt, sometimes to receive unworthy pain on their behalf, we never become the instrument of healing and restoration that God calls us to be through the work of the gospel. The gospel of Christ, the work of Christ, is the greatest example of the path to relational healing, the path of reconciliation, the path of true community. Christ taught us how to love our enemies. Christ taught us how to forgive those in need of forgiveness. Christ taught us how to be merciful to those who are unworthy of mercy. And Christ taught us how to be touched by the brokenness of others and receive its pain, returning back to them a healing acceptance. This is how we become instruments of healing for others. This is how we learn more deeply of Christ's healing work towards us. This is how we live the gospel in relationship. And this is how we bring reconciliation and healing into our relationships.